The world is increasingly dark and it's affecting our young people. But as parents, are we? Do our young people see something different about our lives? What are we living for?
As parents, we need to equip the next generation to know the truth of God's Word. But more than that, we need to live it out. Our goal is not to raise children that achieve the American dream. No, we have an eternal focus. Our lives are about God and saying yes to the adventure He has for each one of us.
We need to pass the banner on to the next generation so that they can carry the light of Jesus to every dark corner of the world.
This is Chosen Jen, and you're listening to the Discipleship Parenting Podcast. Hi everyone, this is Justin. I am joined by my wife Katie. We are really excited to be starting a new podcast series. It's a quick 2-week series that we're calling Cloud of Witnesses, which comes from Hebrews 12 verse 1. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at 2 different Christians who hopefully will really inspire you in your faith. The first person we're looking at today is Gladys Aylward. If you're feeling ordinary, like you have not that much to offer, or maybe that's just because people have told you that, then this one is really meant for you. I think it's going to fire you up and be an encouragement to you. While we were in youth ministry, we wanted to share these stories with our teen group. So Katie did a lot of research into these 2 Christians, and she wrote these short life summaries so that we could do the same sort of thing, motivate them and show them how God is still working in the lives of ordinary people. And so we are excited to bring these to you, and I will turn this podcast over to Katie as she reads you the life of Gladys Aylward.
Born on February 24th, 1902, in London, Gladys Aylward's early life was most ordinary. The daughter of a mailman and a housewife, Gladys went to school until she was about 14 and then began working as a housemaid. While she had grown up in a Christian home, she didn't think much about her faith until one day when she heard a minister share his passion for spreading the good news of Jesus across the world, more specifically in China. That meeting forever changed Gladys, and she knew God was calling her to go be a missionary to China. 12 years later, Gladys faced utter disappointment when the director of the China Inland Missionary Society's training school sat her down and informed her that she was going to be released from the school. She was too old and unqualified, and younger and brighter students deserved to have her spot at the school. It was nothing personal towards Gladys. It was simply the reality of the situation. Gladys was crushed. She was not qualified to be a missionary, but she knew in her heart that China was where God wanted her to be. So, even though it seemed almost insulting when the director of the missionary school offered to give her a recommendation as a housemaid for a missionary couple, the Fishers, who had recently come back from China, Gladys accepted the position. She hoped this might provide an opportunity for her to talk to them about her desire to do mission work in China. Gladys constantly asked the Fishers everything they knew about China and kept track of the information they shared in her private journal. The Fishers soon realized they could not allow Gladys to simply remain a housemaid for them. She had a desire to share the love of Jesus. So they helped her get a position of a rescue sister, patrolling the streets of Swansea, Wales for runaway girls, to prevent them from turning to a life of prostitution. While Gladys loved being able to help these young girls and to share with them the love of Jesus, something was still missing. She felt that she was meant to be a missionary to China. Gladys knew she would never get to China without money. So she quit her position as a rescue sister and took a job as a housemaid to Sir Francis' young husband. When she arrived at her new housemaid job, she had nothing to her name. She had spent almost all of her money paying the cost of her fare to get there. She took her Bible out of her suitcase and placed on top of it the 2.5 pennies she had left after her trip. How would she ever have enough money to get to China? Gladys chose to pray. Here is my Bible. Here is all the money I have. Here is me. Find some way to use me, God. After finishing her prayer, there was a knock on the door. The lady of the house wanted to see Gladys. She asked her what the price had been for her travel to their home. When Gladys told her, she immediately gave that amount of money to Gladys, informing her that she always paid the price of the fare for the people that came to work in her home. Just like that, in only a few minutes since her prayer, God had increased Gladys's money by 15 times. As the weeks went by, Gladys saved every penny she made. One day she headed down to the local shipping agency to see how much it would cost for a one-way ticket to China. The price would be 90 pounds, 30 times more than what Gladys had saved. There was no way she would be able to afford that amount of money. The man working there told her that if she were to take the train that would go through Europe, Russia, Siberia, and then down to China, it would only cost 47 pounds. However, he warned, there was currently a war going on between Siberia and China. Despite the man's warnings, Gladys decided she would take the train. She opened an account that day by giving all that she had, 3 pounds as the first down payment for the passage. She promised to return every Friday after that and put down more money. She now knew how she would get there. While she continued to work and save up money to pay her passage to China, Gladys decided it was important that she also figure out what she would do once she arrived there. So she practiced preaching and sharing her faith by going to Hyde Park and standing on a soapbox talking about Jesus. She learned everything she could about China by borrowing books from her employer, Mr. Younghusband, who had previously been an explorer in China. The only question that Gladys still had was what she would do once she got to China. But she prayed to God and trusted that God would provide that answer too. One Sunday after church, a woman told her about a certain Mrs. Lawson, a 73-year-old Englishwoman who had served in China as a missionary with her husband, who had recently passed away. Now she had returned to China to continue serving there without him. The woman gave Gladys Mrs. Lawson's contact information. Gladys now had her answer. She knew where she was going. She wrote to Mrs. Lawson and informed her that she was coming. A few months after writing to Mrs. Lawson, Gladys found herself standing on the train platform saying goodbye to everyone that had meant something to her there in England, including the clerk from the shipping agency where she'd bought her ticket. With a small suitcase filled with a few clothes, a second one filled with food for the journey, and a cooking pot tied to that suitcase, Gladys was a sight to see. With a mere 2 pounds and 9 shillings to her name, Gladys set off for China. Little did Gladys know what a treacherous journey the train ride would end up being. After several days on the train, the railroad path to China took her deeper and deeper into Russia. No one spoke English any longer, and the more and more citizens left the train at each stop, while even more soldiers came on board. At one point, in the depths of Siberia, she was ordered to leave the train at the next station. Gladys wouldn't even consider it. She must get to China. What would happen if she got off the train? So she sat on her suitcase and refused to move. The train continued on. Only 30 miles later, the train stopped again. This time, it would not move. The soldiers got off, and the engineer tried to communicate to Gladys that the train would not be heading on any further. Instead, it would be heading back once it had filled up with wounded soldiers from the war raging just a few miles ahead of them. The delay could take weeks. Gladys ended up trekking the 30 miles back to the last town over the next 3 days through the Siberian winter. When she finally arrived at the town, she was put into custody without food for 2 days and questioned about why she was in Siberia and why she was going to China. When at last she was let go, she was sent by train to another town in Russia, where she was told she could make a connection with a different train going to China. However, when she arrived in this town, she faced even more danger. The place she thought was a hotel turned out to be a trap for Russian kidnappers trying to enslave people for labor. Her every move was being tracked. One night, after being almost kidnapped and raped, Gladys narrowly escaped after convincing a Japanese cargo ship to take her to China. Finally, after 3 weeks of traveling, Gladys had almost reached her destination, Tianjin, China. There, Mrs. Lawson would meet her and take her back to her village. However, upon Gladys's arrival, she was met with more bad news. Mrs. Lawson had never believed she would actually come, so she was not there to meet her. Worse yet, the village where Mrs. Lawson was working, Teschau, was another 3-week journey deeper into China. Despite her weariness and disappointment, Gladys continued on. When she finally reached Teschau 25 days later, she met a kind missionary woman, but it wasn't Mrs. Lawson. Her name was Mrs. Smith. She told Gladys that Mrs. Lawson had moved even further west to a town that was a 2-day travel by mule train. And so, completely exhausted, Gladys now found herself riding up the mountains with a mule train. All she had left was the name of a missionary woman she'd never met before and no money. She was riding into a town where no one spoke her language and the people were known to hate and reject foreigners. Gladys knew that God would need to come through for her because without him, she had nothing. Thankfully, upon arriving in the village of Yangcheng, Mrs. Lawson was there. But to her further dismay, Gladys found out that Mrs. Lawson was nothing like the sweet missionary woman Mrs. Smith she had met in Testchow. She was blunt and did not have a warm personality. Nonetheless, Gladys was glad to finally have arrived, and Mrs. Lawson was glad to see her. Gladys was so relieved. Her new home was a dilapidated old building that felt nothing like a home. When she decided to take a small walk around the town to get a feel for her new home, she quickly learned that what Mrs. Smith had told her was true. She was called a foreign devil and pelted with dirt by the local women in the marketplace. Returning to Mrs. Lawson, she broke down crying. Mrs. Lawson briskly informed her that she had never met a more disagreeable and unfriendly group of people as the people of Yangcheng. After seeing how difficult it was going to be to win the trust of this community, Mrs. Lawson and Gladys, along with Mrs. Lawson's cook, Yang, decided they would open an inn for the mule teams that daily came through Yangcheng. They would offer a clean place to sleep, a good meal, and something no one else did: good stories. While the travelers ate their dinner, Mrs. Lawson would share Bible stories with them. While the first few travelers did not come easily, word soon spread through the area that the Inn of the Eighth Happinesses was a great place to stay. Within 10 months of Gladys's arrival in Yangcheng, the inn was constantly busy. Then, just as it seemed things would be going well, Mrs. Lawson and her were making progress and sharing the gospel with the people who came to the inn. Tragedy struck. Mrs. Lawson fell off a dilapidated balcony in a nearby town and died within a few weeks from her injuries. Once again, Gladys found herself alone, feeling unqualified to continue the work, and completely reliant on God to show her what to do next. She was still only partially able to speak the local dialect. She also quickly found out how much it cost to run the inn. The constant stream of customers provided enough money to cover the costs for the food and upkeep of the inn, but each year a large sum of tax money also had to be paid to the local governing authority, the Mandarin. Gladys discovered that Mrs. Lawson had been paying this tax out of her missionary stipend. The Mandarin was the most powerful man in Yangcheng. Not only was he in charge of the village, but he was also the administrator of law and justice. If Gladys didn't pay these taxes, she could be jailed or even put to death. What could she do? She could not go and simply talk to the Mandarin. Just as she was thinking through her options, she was informed that the Mandarin was coming her way to speak with her personally. Gladys was taken aback and overwhelmed. She had no idea why he was coming to see her. But Gladys couldn't have been more surprised by the reason for the visit. The Mandarin was offering her a job. The Chinese government had ruled that foot binding was no longer going to be allowed in China. All girls under the age of 10 were ordered to have their feet unbound. Many of the small villages needed to be informed of this new law and required to enforce it. The Mandarin, though, was in a tough position. It was considered improper for a Chinese man to look at a woman's feet. However, all the women he knew could communicate and enforce the new law had bound feet that hindered them from being able to travel over the mountains to all the other villages. Except for Gladys. She had big unbound feet, and so the Mandarin had decided she would be the perfect person for the job. Before the Mandarin left from the meeting with Gladys, she spoke up bravely. She informed him that if she went to do this, she would also speak to the people about her God and her faith. To her surprise, and perhaps because the Mandarin was desperate for a foot inspector, she was given permission to do this. In this way, God provided Gladys with the funds needed to continue running the inn, as well as providing a new opportunity for Gladys to travel from village to village, inspecting feet and sharing stories about God and the way to salvation. It wasn't long before she was loved and respected throughout the entire district. In addition, her Yangcheng dialect improved, and she soon spoke it better than many of the locals. Soon there were groups of Christian believers forming throughout the villages. Not surprisingly, though, God wasn't through using this small, simple, faithful Gladys. One day, the Mandarin summoned her to meet with him. He informed her that there was a prison riot going on and the convicts were killing each other. The Mandarin soldiers were afraid to go into the prison, but someone had to stop the riot. He had decided that Gladys should be the person to do it. She was constantly telling everyone that she had the living God inside of her, so he figured that meant she couldn't die. Gladys was stunned. How could she explain to the Mandarin that being filled with the Holy Spirit didn't mean she was incapable of dying? Gladys realized that she had to go into the prison. Everything she'd been telling the people about her God hung in the balance of her doing so. Despite her overwhelming fear, Gladys agreed to go in. Having prayed to God for protection, Gladys entered the prison. Here stood one small woman alone against a gang of rioting prisoners. As she entered, she was greeted by the sight of men killing each other. The dead and wounded were lying everywhere, and with more confidence than she felt, Gladys commanded a man swinging a large sword to stop what he was doing and commanded all the inmates to line up before her. To her shock, they all obeyed. After talking with them, she could see that the men had been stripped of all human dignity in the prison. She promised to them that she would fix that. Miraculously, she was able to get the prisoners to stop their rioting, and the prison returned to calmness. Gladys was faithful to her promise to the prisoners. After God's miraculous calming of the prison riot, Gladys worked with the Mandarin to bring reform to the prison. The prisoners called her Awada, which means virtuous one. She visited the prisoners every day after that, reading them stories from the Bible and teaching them hygiene and other skills. News of her prison reforms soon spread throughout the area, and all the people began to call her Awada. Years went by and things were going smoothly for Gladys. The inn continued to be successful. She had won the hearts of the people in her village and beyond, and Christianity was growing in the area. Gladys had adopted 5 orphan children that she had rescued off the streets, and in 1936 she became the first foreign missionary to become a Chinese citizen. Gladys became known as someone who was willing to help and care for anyone who needed it. But in 1938, disaster struck. The Japanese bombed Yangcheng. No sooner had the village buried their dead from the bombing than they were informed that they would need to flee the area because the Japanese were only 3 days' march away. Gladys took herself, her 5 children, and about 40 other people she was responsible for and fled to caves outside a nearby village. Months passed, and more people brought children to Awada, orphaned by the war or separated from their parents. Soon, Gladys had over 200 children under her care. When it became clear they would no longer be able to go home permanently to Yangcheng, the Mandarin invited Gladys to one final banquet before everyone left. Not only was Gladys invited to this meeting of the well-known officials, she was given the seat of honor next to the Mandarin. The most remarkable moment of the event occurred when the Mandarin stood up, spoke of all that Gladys had done not only in their village but also in the neighboring villages, and then stated that he too wanted to follow Gladys's God and become a Christian. Gladys was overwhelmed. She could have never imagined 14 years ago what God had now accomplished through her simple life of loving service. Remarkably, the feat that Gladys is most famous for is none of the aforementioned events. Shortly after this final exit from Yangcheng in 1940, Gladys was forced to flee over Japanese-infested mountains with 100 children in order to bring them to an orphanage that could help them escape from the war-torn area. They left on what they thought would be a 12-day journey with inadequate food and clothing. However, what should have been a challenging enough 12-day trek turned into a 27-day nightmare. Despite the severe cold, the constant walking, the paralyzing fear of running into hostile Japanese soldiers, and the fact that they should have starved to death in the mountains, Gladys brought all of the 100 children to safety. Not one of the children was lost on the journey. Gladys, however, was not so lucky. After bringing the children to safety, she collapsed and fell into a coma for 2 months due to malnutrition, severe exhaustion, typhus, and pneumonia. It was a miracle that she had survived the journey, let alone managed to do it safely with 100 children in tow. While Gladys eventually recovered from her illnesses, her body was never the same afterwards. However, that didn't stop Awada from continuing to spread the news of Jesus everywhere she continued to go in China. After some years spent back in England, Gladys could not stay away from China. She wanted to return, but unfortunately, communism would not allow her to go into the country. So she served the people from Taiwan, where she passed away at the age of 67, doing what she loved. Gladys was a small woman who, by worldly standards, did not appear fit for more than a job of a housemaid. Yet she didn't let people stop her from pursuing the plans God had for her life. She was faithful, persistent, hard-working, and had incredible faith in God. God chose her, a simple, ordinary person, to declare his glory and to show what he could do through someone who is willing to obey his calling.
All right, I really hope that this story of Gladys Aylward's life has left you feeling very encouraged, maybe rejuvenated. Remember, when we follow God, he is the one in charge of bringing the results and taking our simple lives and turning them into something more than we could ever ask or imagine. So seek God in his word, go to him in prayer. He has a specific plan and purpose for each one of us. And be sure to share that message with your kids. They need to be reminded that their life has a purpose and they're not a mistake, which is what they might be hearing all the time. We look forward to being with you next week as we read our second life story of George Mueller, which is one of my favorites. So until then, have a great week and we will talk to you next time.